to make us. I've felt that more times than not in the last couple of years. I don't understand. I don't have it all figured out. And so this is not going to be, just like Preston said, it's not going to be 10 points on how to grow your rural church. But what I want to do is just highlight how Jesus keeps showing up in our rural congregation, and I just keep circling back to what he is doing. And I've been talking to rural pastors and leaders the last couple of years and reflecting on the scriptures, reflecting on the classic tradition of the church, and really trying to understand that and reflect on my own ministry. And what I want to do is just tell some stories, kind of tell on myself. And look, my context is rural. I get that not everybody here is in a rural setting. Some of you might be in suburban or urban or might define yourself totally different. That's cool. I love the rural church, but that doesn't mean that we got to knock on urban and suburban or whatever else to be able to love the early church or rural church. And my hope is that as we speak about the rural church, this can really be kind of a doorway for you to reflect on wherever you're at. So here's what I want to do. I want to start off by laying the groundwork for what rural is, and just kind of talk about context. And then I want to use that as a way to talk about how rural ministry flows from a sense of that concept. I'm going to develop a couple of concepts in the second part, more and less, use those as doorways into thinking about rural ministry. And then I'm going to wrap everything up in our third session in the afternoon, talking about prayer, which I really think ties everything together. And we will build in some time at the end of each of the sessions for you to do some table talk. And we've got a discussion sheet and questions we're going to get out to you. And then before the third session, I think we'll have a chance for some talk back and pushback. But look, I love to talk church. I love to talk theology. I love to compare notes. And so I'll be like hanging around at the back between sessions, and you can catch me then. All right, and I just want to recognize too that at this point, it's kind of hard to be a pastor or a leader in the rural church, right? Like small church ministry is possibly one of the hardest things. I was talking to somebody the other day, and he said, "Brother, the times are impossible." And I thought that just sums it up perfectly, right? There we are. I mean, you could try to put a handle on it, talk about COVID or politics or whatever, but the times are impossible. And here we are. And I recently wrote a piece on rural pastor burnout, and I did interviews with a bunch of pastors and leaders around the country in different traditions. And those are a lot of tender conversations, and I felt it too. And so I get that. I think a lot of us are kind of feeling that sense of like, where to next? What do we do next? And so wherever you're at as a pastor, leader, I just hope you come away feeling encouraged today. God's committed to you. God's committed to his church. But I want to start with two basic questions, and these are the two questions that I asked myself when I first plunked down behind my desk in the backside of this little rural church in Washington State. I was fresh out of seminary, didn't know a soul except for a couple of folks in our new congregation, and I plunked down on that desk and I just said, where am I? And then I asked myself, what am I supposed to be doing here? And I'm convinced that rural ministry, or really any ministry, begins from a love of place and a respect for the unique contours of a place. So Wendell Berry, the great agrarian writer, he talks about how we've got to develop a respectable agriculture, which means for him learning to think competently and kindly of lands of all sorts. And I think about that when we maybe just swap in the word church for lands, and you get this if you've got any experience in agriculture, that not all land is fit for the same purpose. In Kansas, you've got some great wheat country. You can maybe grow a little bit of corn, not like they can in Illinois, but you can grow some corn. And then, there's some spots that are going to be rocky. You run cattle on that. If you got a bunch of briars and weeds, I recommend goats, right? Like it just kind of depends what you're dealing with. You don't try to plant the corn into the rocky ground. Well, so Wendell Berry makes that point about agriculture and kind of digs into that. But I think we could swap out agriculture for churches and say we've got to learn to think competently and kindly about churches of all kinds, right? So think about the cultural geography of a place. Have a vision for that, right? Not just be grabbing what someone else is teaching. Think am I rural or am I urban or am I suburban? Is, rural where? Is it rural Ohio or Pennsylvania? That's going to look different than rural Kansas or rural New England or rural New Mexico, or, place yourself on there, right? Think about what is my setting? And there's going to be a lot of diversity whenever we think about rural settings. It's not all the same thing. And just, of course, I'm talking about North America. I think there's a lot of similarities between Canada and the United States. Of course, if you step outside of North America, you're going to experience a lot of other kinds of rural diversity. We served in Peru, up in the mountains, and we were connecting with rural communities around the city of Cusco. And I remember sometimes we'd go out to these communities from the city of Cusco and do these like late night praise and worship, evangelistic sessions, and I'm like literally falling over because I'm so tired. I remember one time I was so tired, they just like laid me down on a bunch of sleeping bags. They're like, Pastor, you just go sleep here, right? But sometimes I'm just so tired because they're standing there and clapping and singing for hours, and after that would be over, they'd push these little rickety pews away and they'd be like, Pastor, now it is time to dance. Now, I don't know about CMC Mennonites, but I'll tell you, my kind of Mennonites, we don't dance, to my wife's great disappointment. But where are you at? It's going to be a different context wherever you are. I think that's the first question. I want to come back around to that. Where am I, right? Where am I? Think about that, and think about what is your community. And so here, I'm going to give you like a real quick, just a super quick assignment, and I don't want to lose you totally. We're going to do 15 seconds, okay? And I want you just to turn to the person next to you, or like to two people next to you, and just say like, what is your community? How do you think about it? We're going to dig into this in a second, but how would you define your community? Are you rural? Are you suburban? Or are you urban? So just turn to the person next to you, say, what's your community, rural, urban, or suburban? So just do that. Okay, let's bring it back around. Okay, and look, so I know you're not all rural. I know there's going to be some diversity. I know CMC is a diverse community, but we're going to focus on rural a little bit. Rural doesn't always get as much attention, so that's what we're doing this morning. But I want to think about what is rural, okay? So I'm going to also invite you here just to kind of shout this out in a second. Like, think about this. What is rural? How about I put it like this? You know you're rural if, right? Fill in the blank. You remember, like, what was that guy that was Jeff Foxworthy, right? You know you're a redneck if, or no, you might be a redneck if, yeah. So let's do that. Like, you might be rural if, and just shout that out, and I'll give you mine, okay? You might be rural if you get a Dollar General and it changes your life. Yeah. We got a Dollar General, and get this, I have talked to two different rural pastors in two totally different contexts at different times, and they both said that to me word for word. We got a Dollar General, and it changed my life. Unprompted. All right, you might be rural. If. Oh man, it didn't work. Okay, shout it out. Your dog runs loose. Okay, I hope you folks are hearing it because I'm missing it. But it's like, cows outnumber people. Yes, yeah. Roosters wake you up. Now, roosters are not allowed in our rural community. Yeah, you dress up to go to Walmart, yeah. Yeah. I got some stories about that one. But, okay. All right, so you're getting me. You know what I'm talking about, right? You might be rural if. Like there's something going on. There's something distinct to this rural environment. And like it's kind of tricky to get a handle on what exactly is rural. There's some really ancient like cultural ideals about what rural is. I mean, on the one hand, like go back to Roman times, they already talked like this. Rural people, they're like on the one hand, maybe they're hicks in the middle of nowhere, or maybe rural people are like the salt of the earth. They're all honest and hardworking, good people, right? What is it? And culturally speaking, and there's some different ways to define rural. The U.S. Census, the U.S. Census starts out, and they do some work on how to define rural. And the way the U.S. Census begins their definition of rural is by saying, rural is not urban. So, yeah, so that's helpful. But then in what ways is rural not urban? And then really, why does it matter? So I heard this story from somebody in our community. I was talking to them, and they were saying how they had it was Thanksgiving or Christmas or something, and they had all the kids back home with their grandkids, and they have a daughter-in-law from Los Angeles, and she's there with the family visiting in Moundridge, 1,974 people, and she's got all these little ones around the table, and they pull out all the booster seats at Grandma and Grandpa's place, and there are not enough booster seats for all these little munchkins. And so the granddaughter from Los Angeles says, "Hey, Pops, I got an idea. We don't have enough booster seats, but no problem. Let's just get a phone book, and we'll put a phone book under the last kid that needs a booster seat." And so Grandpa said, all right, walked over, got the Moundridge phone book, and came back and said, "Here you go." So rural, there's less people, right? What is it exactly? There's less people, that's got to play into it somehow. What about agriculture? We're talking about cows and chickens and stuff like that. We know agriculture plays into rural in some sense, but not everybody in rural communities is involved in agriculture. You see the agriculture around you, right? And there's some ways that you experience some of those rural agricultural rhythms because suddenly, harvest is happening or planting is happening. Especially as pastors, we can feel some of those. But the statistics nationwide are that when you look at agriculture, it's about 6% of rural folks who are involved in agriculture. So 6%, that feels about right for our community. In our church, we've got some folks that have some family land, but they are not farmers first and foremost. They, run a trenching business or run the hardware store or whatever, but they've got a little bit of land, but they're not first and foremost farmers. So 6%. And then that's opposed to 1% of folks in the city are involved in agriculture, which I find kind of fascinating. I think part of that 1% would be folks who are living in small to medium-sized cities who are driving out to work at the chicken farm or whatever, and so they work in agriculture, but they live in a city. I think some of it is the exotic stuff, like the growing lettuce in hothouses on the roofs of high-rises in Chicago. It's that sort of stuff too. But it's kind of interesting to think about what would the sheer numbers be, because you got so many more folks in an urban setting. What are 1% of urban folks involved in agriculture? What does that compare to 6% of rural? Just to say, it's a little more complicated than to say like rural is all agrarian or agricultural. And think about your own experience. What's your skill set? Would you know how to pull a calf? If you're living in a rural area, don't get me on that, right? Or can you drive a combine? Can you back up a trailer? Some of those things that are like rural skill set, just because you live rural doesn't mean you've got that. But age demographics tend to skew a little bit differently in rural settings. So we think about median age of rural being 51, whereas 37 is the median age of urban. And of course, if you're in a college town, that's going to look even different. You get into some of these densely like packed towns that have a lot of universities in a small area, that just changes the feel of the whole community. And like our community, it took us 3 times to pass our school bond, because we've got a ton of folks that move to the area to retire in Mound Ridge, which is awesome. They bring a ton of accumulated knowledge, and they're great people, but they're just going to naturally have different priorities than 30-something and 40-something parents who are trying to get their kids through school, right? So it took us 3 times to pass that bond. Changes the priorities and the feel of the community. So that 51 median age in rural. And of course, rural can also be really diverse. It can be ethnically diverse. It's not all white folks. It can be economically diverse. You look at rural communities that are, say, in a touristy area like we are now, within an hour or so of the big city. That's going to be a totally different ball of wax than if you get out to, south central or north central Kansas, where you're hours from the nearest hospital and urban center. And also culturally diverse. You just got a lot of different kinds of people in rural. And I actually saw a statistic the other day that showed that many rural communities are actually more ethnically diverse than some smallish cities, which I kind of find interesting. But let's get back to kind of, the census here. So the census said rural is not urban, but then they break this down a little bit more. And the census says that rural is 2,500 people or less, with a population density of less than 1,000 people per square mile. So there's not a lot of us, and we're not packed in. And I kind of like that, because you think about what happens around that 2,500 mark, at least in the communities that I know and have gotten to connect with. There's sort of a way in which you lose track of people, and you don't, at 2,500, you don't know everybody anymore, right? Like, you can't place them all on the family tree. The USDA, they've also got a definition of rural. Now, what they do is they've got a set of codes, these continuum codes. So if you are a 1, you are a really large urban center. That's 1 million plus. If you are a 9, there it lines up with the census. So you are 2,500 or less. And so you can look this up. If you look up USDA continuum codes, you can look this up and find what the code is for your county, because they've got a code for every county in the United States. So census and the USDA really about numbers. That helps us. But for me, what I think is the most interesting and helpful is to think about rural in terms of what is called the social constructivist approach. And that's just some fancy language that's used by sociologists to say that rural is more like a culture or a worldview that is defined by its relationship to the city. It's defined by nearness of neighbor and population and agriculture, but none of those things wholly gets at what rural is. So it's more of a culture. And so, like sociologist Robert Wuthnow, he talks about rural as a moral community. And what he's saying is not that rural places are moral while suburbs and urban areas are immoral. That's not what he's getting at, but he's using this kind of idiosyncratic or specifically word for sociologists to say it's a moral community, in that it's a group of people who are connected by ties of obligation and relationship. And so what I think about is this, that rural communities are places where people are known and where they know each other. And that there's kind of an expectation that people know who I am and I know who they are. And I think that's what that starts to break down and play out in a different way when you get to like the 2,500 mark, right? So you might not really know everybody in your village, even when you're under that 2,500 mark, but you sort of think you do, right? You sort of believe that you kind of can put everybody on the family tree. You expect that when you go out for a walk, you're going to see somebody that you know. You expect that if there is a disaster, like a house fire or something, you expect people are going to show up for that, right? You've got these, there's formal responsibilities and contracts, there's jobs and obligations and whatever, but you've got these informal ties that kind of hold the community together. And that's what I think gives rural communities their distinctive feel, the sense of knowing and being known, and how that plays out through those relationships. And this is why you hear people in rural communities, at least folks in my community, say things like, our town's grown a little bit over the last couple decades, and people go, man, I just don't know all those kids on the basketball team anymore, right? Really resonated with Jay saying earlier that a lot of times our small towns have kind of an inordinate emphasis, over-the-top emphasis on youth sports. Like we got that to a T in Mound Ridge. And so people look and they're like kind of proud on the one hand, like there's all these kids that I don't know and they're good, but I don't know them. They don't have the same last names. They're not all Krables and Stookies and Kaufmans anymore. Or once, here's another one. You might be rural. If we were playing outside in our front yard last fall and his car comes up real slow like and pulls up beside us and rolls down the window and goes, excuse me, I'm looking for the funeral of so-and-so. And I actually knew who it was and where the funeral was and what time it started. And I was like, over there, right? You might be rural if you can send people to the funeral that's going on, right? So, you just hang on to this concept, though, a little bit of known and knowable community, because I think this is going to play into this sense of how we talk about community structure, how people move in and out of our communities and congregations, or don't. And I'm trying to get at this. We're using rural as our handle, but of course, rural and the culture of a place, it's always going to be more than just population density. And using like rural, urban, suburban, that's always going to only be one way to slice things. And there might be other ways for you that are more important. These might not even be the most helpful, but I just kind of think about this as like one piece in your toolbox, one way to slice your community. I mean, culture, of course, has all sorts of elements to it. I mean, there's they interact, they overlap in complex ways. I mean, there's language and ethnicity, there's faith and socioeconomic level, and so, and culture, it's not just like cultural production. So it's not just like TV and theater or something like that. I think all places have a culture, and so we're always asking this fundamentally culture-seeking question of where am I, right? We're making it our business to understand something of how our local culture enacts itself. And I think part of the work and the calling of the church is to know well and to love well the culture we find ourselves in, the place and the people who are nearby. So how do we get at this? Well, a couple of resources that I have found that are helpful. One is called the ARDA, the Association of Religion Data Archives, housed at Penn State. And what they do is somehow they've got a methodology where they break down communities based on what religious tradition they affiliate with. And what they've got is a category that they call unclaimed. And I don't know if they mean that the people themselves don't claim a faith or if they are unclaimed by other faith traditions. And I can't say for sure how accurate these numbers are, but I think it's kind of interesting. And I'm going to show you a slide here in a second to talk about Madison County, Ohio, which is where Rosedale is, right? But the other one that I think is kind of interesting is what's called the community. The same part. They got this community builder profile. You can do a sphere of influence, and you can see, like, say, set at the center of this on your church, and see within your sphere of influence what other congregations are out there, and then you can kind of figure out like what other. What the population is, but let me show you an example here. So here's Madison County, Ohio. Am I right that Madison County, Ohio is where Rosedale is? Okay, Madison County, Ohio, what I discovered, maybe my numbers aren't right, but 43,435 folks in Madison County, Ohio. And according to this, look at that number, 29,667 are unclaimed, right? So there are three CMC congregations within Madison County, a total of 441 people. This is all according to the ARDA, right? So, and their numbers come from 2010. I don't know when they're going to release the new ones, but you get at least a kind of a thumbnail sketch. Folks, there's like, if you're a pastor, like there's like at least 2 sermons right here. Look at that. It's like a skyscraper, right? These are unclaimed folks right around Rosedale. And I just chose that. You pick your county. Here are all kinds of folks that we can reach out to, that we can touch, that the kingdom can be extended into their lives. Like 29,667 people, like you could build a couple of CMC churches out of that, right? That's 68% of the population. So I don't know, maybe, you can play with those numbers, tell me if you think they're right or not, but I think like this is kind of interesting to me. Another one that's kind of interesting is, here's the sphere of influence. Just did this around Rosedale Bible College, and you can kind of see within that, like language, income, housing, other churches, total population. Just give you some data. Another one that's kind of interesting is the citydata.com, and you can look that up, kind of what's your housing availability, income, tax info, whatever. But all of this to say, this is just kind of like grist for the mill, all this to say that I'm convinced that place matters. And we've got to be paying attention to our place. And I love the words of Eugene Peterson, the late great pastor and writer. He said that pastoral work is geographical as much as theological. And I think what this means, if we take place seriously, is that we learn to cultivate the church in the place where we find ourselves. And we need to have some kind of understanding of the promise and the challenges that are faced by the people and places where we are ministering. In recent years, there has been more attention that has gone towards rural. It started off, I think, in 2016, being more positive, inquisitive attention. In 2020, it was less positive, but there has been more attention in kind of the national media circles towards what is rural and what's going on there. And one of the first kind of rural explainers was J.D. Vance. And I realize that now J.D. Vance is no longer so much the rural explainer and now a politician in Ohio, so I'm not trying to get into that. I'm just saying at the very beginning, he was someone who kind of picked up the zeitgeist. He understood the moment and had written this book that was helping people understand something of rural. But what J.D. Vance was writing about was really just a very limited sphere of rural Appalachia. And a lot of people latched onto that, and that might be your sphere. But a lot of people kind of latched onto that as if that were the only face of rural. And the picture that he paints is pretty stark if you've ever read this book. I mean, it's like every rural place is falling apart like a rusty pickup truck, and it's just this, like everybody's moving out of rural. It's all opioid addictions. It's all poverty. I mean, people kind of like picked up on that. And it's sort of, I call it the narrative of rural decline. And it's not all J.D. Vance. It's sort of like people picked up on what he wrote and took it, to the nth degree, where just the rural is totally falling apart. Like a couple of years ago, I saw this article in the New York Times, and it was breathlessly claiming that vast swaths of the Great Plains, like where we're living, that they were farmed by satellite-linked harvesters driven by remote control. And that sounds really awesome to me, but I have yet to see one of these things, right? But there's for sure farmers have got all kinds of sophisticated gadgetry inside of their tractors and stuff. But the way I understood this article, it's like there's nobody living out in the rural Great Plains anymore. And so we're like sitting in Manhattan, like driving the combine or something like that. And like the truck comes up and somebody's driving that truck. That's what I understood. Maybe I got it wrong. But it's kind of just this image, we talk about flyover territory, right? You only live on the coast and there's flyover territory. Well, it's kind of like flyover territory taken to the extreme, where it's like the Great Plains or Mars or something. Just send in the rovers. It's uninhabitable. And so you get these ideas sometimes when you read certain things, like from people that are maybe in a particular setting, that like rural is just this negative thing that's fallen apart. But there's so much more to it than that, and so much more beauty. And so what I think we've got to do is just kind of start off first by saying, like, all right, if it's not all just falling apart, well, then what is it, right? Like maybe start off just say, like, well, what is rural? What is it not? right? It's not all farmers. We know that. It's not all poverty. It's not all drug addiction. There's all kinds of stuff going on in rural. But I mean, like, ask, what's the culture of your community? Or what are the overlapping cultures of your community? How do people in your area see the world? What do they value? What do they celebrate? I got that last one from the mayor of Garden City, Kansas, which is, it's a micropolitan community in western Kansas. It's really not rural. It's 27,000 people, but, it's still not a huge city. And so he said that, well, Garden City, you got to know this about Garden City. It's a big ranching and meatpacking part of the country. And Garden City, Kansas boasts 22 different languages in this in the school district, in a town of 27,000 people. So you've got folks, from Latin America, you got folks from Asia, you got a whole bunch of folks from Somalia. So all these different languages, 22 different languages. And so the principal of the school said, hey, what do they celebrate? Right? Let's find a way to get on board with that. I was talking to a church planter in Ephraim, Utah. And he talked about how he had this methodology for planting his church, and what he did, think about Utah. What do you know about Utah? Who are there a lot of in Utah? Mormons, right? And, Mormons are nice people, but, they're really not part of, like, the historic stream of Orthodox Christian faith. And so he had this vision to go into Ephraim, Utah, and plant a biblical church. And what he did to do that was launch a home painting business. And he would go into people's houses and paint their homes. And this was a real business. It was not a front. He was really making his income by painting houses. And he said this, like, he'd be in there painting houses, and then he'd start up conversation with people, and he'd invite them to this Bible study, and that Bible study grew, and then the Bible study became a church in Ephraim, Utah. Well, he said this, that, look, you got to come into a community like Ephraim with all these Mormon folks. You got to come in, and you got to value some of the things that people value here. You got to value the structure of the community, value the religious family systems. You can't just come in and say, these Mormons, they're a bunch of whatever. You can't do that. You got to come in and find places that are beautiful and highlight that, right? Find ways that your values intersect with theirs. So think about that in your community. Does your area perceive itself to be growing, or declining, or holding steady? Does your community have a sense of optimism, or a sense of marginality and loss, right? Just come in, just notice your place. What do they celebrate? What do they value? And yeah, you're not gonna be able to get on board with everything, right? But where are places that your values and theirs intersect? And I think for me, two key disciplines that come into play as we're thinking about how we engage with our rural context are noticing and valuing. So for me, this has given our rural communities the National Geographic treatment. It's just, I think, especially important in rural, in light of the ways that rural areas are often undervalued. And maybe you don't experience that in some of these areas like we are right now. I mean, what a treat for me to be here in Western Maryland with these mountains and bodies of water. It's just so gorgeous. I kept having these eye-popping moments when I was driving in, and ear-popping moments, going down in the valley. It's like, this is such a treat. It's so beautiful. And people love to come to these places to vacation and spend a week. But, a lot of rural places don't have that same kind of straightforward beauty going for them. And so they get undervalued by kind of officialdom. And I want to show you something here. This is something called the Natural Amenities Index or Scale. This was put out by the USDA, and maybe some of you have seen this before, but what the USDA did was take every single county in the United States and assign it a numerical value based on beauty. And the way that they did this, their methodology, was that different features got different values. So it's something like, if you've got high mountains, you get like a 12. If you got medium mountains, you get a 10, whatever. You got, so many miles of open water, you get a 12, right? So mountains, water, climate, they gave every county in the United States a value, and then they color-coded it on this map. And so on this map, you want to be dark green. And there's a whole lot of places that are like orange and yellow that are really close to my heart, like pretty much the entire Great Plains and a bunch of the Midwest. Now, I'm trying to make out Western Maryland. I think I'm seeing some light green there on Western Maryland. And Pennsylvania doesn't do too bad, right? Like you've got kind of a nice swath right down the middle, but Ohio, sorry, Indiana, we're all in the same boat, right? And you can see Kansas, right? It's just kind of one big swath of yellow. But, Illinois, my home state, is even darker. It's all orange. But, you look at this, and it's like, I don't know, I got to be honest, I'm not totally sure what this is for. I mean, I'm just trying to think like these USD folks down in like their desk in Washington, D.C. or something, like coding each county. But maybe it's for like companies that are trying to figure out where they want to relocate. So they want to go somewhere beautiful to attract a workforce. I don't know. But, you look at something like this and you think like, this is, whether or not people have that official designation, a lot of times this is what we do to rural places. We think, there's nothing there. Like Kansas is just all flat and it's not interesting. But I remember I showed this to a pastor in Nebraska, and he said, they must not have included clouds, right? So what about sunsets? What about clouds? What about the grain elevator? I mean, there's all kinds of beautiful things that we can see, but so often they're undervalued. I think we've got to have this paradigm shift in our thinking when we go into rural places, because so often we are accustomed to just seeing need. We've got this narrative of rural decline operating in our heads. We've got this narrative that devalues the beauty of rural places. We've got this narrative that doesn't see the goodness of all and that God has created, both places and people. I think we have to have this paradigm shift. We've got need in front of us, but do we see beauty? Can we see both the natural and the moral beauty of the places that we are operating in? And I think about Paul as our model, the apostle. He goes into Athens, and in Acts chapter 17, he's got some free time on his hand, and Paul is kind of wandering around the big city of Athens, and he goes to Mars Hill, the Areopagus, and he sees, this story, right? Paul sees all of these like altars to different gods, and he sees one to an unknown God, and he uses that as his entree into talking about the gospel. But Paul, when he has a chance to engage the philosophers there on Mars Hill, he sees all these altars, and Luke tells us that Paul is very distressed. But when Paul has the opportunity to engage the philosophers, he doesn't just lay into them and say, you are a bunch of idolaters. When he has a chance to talk to the philosophers, he says, I see you are very religious, right? He looks for some place to connect to their values, and then he begins to talk about the truth of the gospel and Jesus and the resurrection, right? So where are those places that we can come in and notice and name the moral and the natural and the cultural and the familial and the communal beauty of our places, where our values as Christians intersect with the values of our community? Where can we name that? Because listen to this. This is not just an act of strategy. Here's why it's important. This is an act of love. Now, I want to open that up just a little bit. I think there are two concepts that we want to bring in when we talk about rural. One is the Gemeinschaft. The other is the Gesellschaft. And you maybe have heard these words before. When I talk about this stuff with like Catholics and Methodists, they just shrug. But when I talk about Gemeinschaft with Mennonites, a lot of us get kind of a warm, fuzzy feeling. Do you know that word? Yeah. Did you have like a Sunday school called Gemeinschaft or anything like that? Yeah, some of churches do. Or like there's a Gemeinschaft house I've seen somewhere. And anyway, but Gemeinschaft, these are just two loan words that come from German sociology, and they're used to describe two different types of communities. One would be a community that is structured and regulated. This is the Gemeinschaft, structured and regulated by trust, relationships, and social boundaries, whereas the Gesellschaft is a community structured and regulated by institutions, contracts, and prescribed roles. So we're still digging into like what is the culture of rural. And you think about, if you're gonna plot this out, Gemeinschaft versus Gesellschaft, and they are, they're stereotypes, right? But if you're gonna plot this out, which one of these would rural be? Like that's actually, I'm asking you. Yeah, it's Gemeinschaft, but it's a stereotype, but it's Gemeinschaft, right? So rural communities are Gemeinschaft. They are ordered by these trust and relationships, and cities are Gesellschaft. But of course, in rural communities, we have contracts, we have institutions, there are prescribed roles, but there is something kind of to this. I sort of like it as just like a little starting place, where there's this kind of structure that binds us together in rural communities, and it's this sense of trust, right? Of known and knowable community. And so we prize safety, we prize rootedness, we prize interdependency in our rural communities. It's known and knowable, that we have trust for one another, or at least we like to think that we do. So, when we first moved to Mound Ridge, and we're going on 10 years there, we moved to Mound Ridge, and our son was just a little guy at the time, and one day he kind of like got philosophical, and he said, Dad, we've got everything we need here in Mound Ridge. We got friends, we've got a church, and we've got a lumber yard. I was like, yeah, that's right. But you go into the lumber yard and you get a 2x4 and you walk into the office and go, hey, I just got a 2x4. And you walk back out and they put it on your account and they bill you at the end of the month. You can do that, right? Just the hardware store, hey, put it on my account. For the longest time, our mechanic, I'd leave our car out front with the keys in it, and he would come and get the car, drive it down, change the oil, bring it back, leave the bill on the seat, and I'd settle up with him later. Early in our time in Mound Ridge, I did this when I was running around like I always am, and my wife and family were traveling, it was just me, and later I called to ask the mechanic about something, and the receptionist says to me, well, I'll get the mechanic, but did you hear about the milk? And I said, the milk? She said, yeah, when he came to bring back to get the car, he noticed that you had left a gallon of milk in the car, and so he just let himself inside and put it in your refrigerator. And I said, thanks. But, you can do that kind of stuff. And now for the first time, last week, folks, woe is me. I had to drive, it changed hands. I had to drive my car down to the mechanic for the first time in 10 years to get the oil changed. But anyway, we know everybody, right? Or we think we do. And so there's this structure that binds us together. And this can be really powerful, like when there's a house fire. But it can also be a challenge because sometimes you try to get a bunch of rural people in a small group to dig deep and share like vulnerabilities and weaknesses. Boy, that's going to be tough because rural communities have a long memory, and folks are not so sure that they want to bring out something that they're wounded in and have that added to the blockchain of memory that will be there forever, that they'll never live down. They're trying to protect reputations and try to sweep things under the rug, and sadly, including things like sexual abuse. And so sometimes that can be a negative. I mean, that structure is so potent, and often everybody can see that structure except for like the pastor who came in from outside, right? It's so subtle. The structure is so quiet, and it gets played out in so many ways. Like just, who gets invited to what? Who gets to do what in the community? Who gets to sit on the board of so-and-so? What kids can become the homecoming king or queen? What subjects can you talk about, right? People within the structure, they're embedded in that and they know it. But sometimes when you come in from outside, you just don't have a clear sense of that. And I'm going to come back to this afternoon, but I think this is one of the reasons that prayer is so important, because we cannot like hacksaw our way through the structure. And so prayer becomes this kind of like knocking on the walls to try to find a hidden door that we can open and move through. I'll tell you a story. A couple years ago, I had this man just like walked up to our house on a Saturday afternoon when I was sitting in the kitchen, and he was a tall guy. I saw him come walking up, and then I saw him come walking away, and he didn't even ring the doorbell. And I thought, well, what was that? And I ran over to the door and opened it up, and he's kind of walking away, this gentleman, and I say, can I help you? And he says, like, you're the pastor over here at the church, right? I'm like, yeah. He's like, can we talk? And, there we were. We sat in my office for an hour and just go deep about all kinds of stuff with life and faith and whatever. And it turns out, it just didn't even come out in that conversation. It turns out that I had performed a funeral for a relative of his. So that's where he saw me. Another thing that you can do in rural communities is just perform funerals, right? And it turns out that they have a Holderman Mennonite background. The Holderman Mennonites are really strong in our area. And so, we've got this kind of back and forth thing going where, like, since I'm Mennonite, we can talk, but since they're not Holderman Mennonite, there's only so far that they can kind of come towards Mennonite. It's kind of complicated. You probably get it, but it's sort of like this back and forth, these structures that are both allowing and preventing him from talking to me. And I said to my wife after we had that conversation, I'm like, that came out of the blue. I mean, look, that is why we pray and fast. I mean, for these moments that open up doors that we can never expect. But this structure, I was talking to some Assemblies of God pastors in Foley, Minnesota. There are a couple named Jim and Tina Von Wald. In Foley, Minnesota, I mean, you think about Minnesota, it's like Foley's this stereotypical Minnesotan town. So you got, in Foley, Minnesota, you got like a Lutheran church, you got another Lutheran church, you got a Presbyterian church, and you got a Catholic church, right? And so they came in there and they had this vision to connect with people who are on the margins, who maybe weren't fitting into some of the established churches that were there. And he tells me, like, Jim Von Wald, he told me that, like, they were starting this out in the beginning, and somebody came up to them and they said, what in the do we need another church for in this town? They just laid it right out. What in the world do we need another church for in this town? And so they discovered that structure, which was held together by these legacy churches, and not knocking them, they're playing their role. And sometimes our churches are the legacy churches, but that community structure wasn't working for everybody. And they were able to tap into folks that did not fit in those other places, and their church grew really quickly. But then they also found some ways to connect with the overall culture of their place. So, like, they're an Assemblies of God church. You know the Assemblies of God, right? Like, they're Pentecostal, classic Pentecostals, charismatic folks, really attentive to the Spirit. And what they are doing in their church, they have First Communion and confirmation. Like, that is not an assembly. Those are not Assemblies of God things. But their church has grown really quickly. And I think part of the way you could describe it is that they looked at the structure of Foley, Minnesota, and they just kind of took a marker and drew a dotted line around that, allowed a bunch of other people to connect to the gospel and connect to their church that did not fit within the established structure. So, where are ways that we can do that? And, I think for me, it's kind of this overarching image of wanting to expand the us, right? Sometimes you get these us and them dynamics in the structure of rural communities. How do we keep expanding the us? How do we keep bending the barbed wire so new people can step over and join us, right? Be part of us, find fellowship around the gospel with us. And so I think this all points to part of how structure works, that it can have this really challenging feature where it can hold people back, who will associate with who won't, right? Where is the structure? And one of the places you see that is in how people define their community. And so, like, in our community, you tell people where you live, and they say this. Tell me if they do this in your community too. They say, like, oh, you live in the old Golly house, or you live in the old Crable house, right? Do people do that in your community? You can never live that down. And it's kind of like, I talked to a pastor once, he said, like, folks can name who lived in a house 50 years ago, but they can't tell you who lives there now, right? It's like, they're the Martinezes now. They're new. Have you bothered to talk to them, right? Like, sometimes I get a little frustrated, but the community structure extends back into time in ways that we've got to pick up on. And this can be touchy, because sometimes our churches play the role of being on the margins, but sometimes our churches also are part of that structure. And I'll just be real vulnerable with you all. Our church is part of the structure. right? West Zion was founded in 1888. That is right about the time that the Moundridge was founded. German-speaking immigrants, most of them Mennonites, came and hopped off the train after escaping Russia. They said, this looks good, and they started building up this community. And it's really great. But it's part of the structure, and not everybody fits into that. So if you don't have a certain basket of last names, and if you're not sure what Mennonite is, and some of that, like, you don't fit into the structure. And in some ways, and I'm not going to get into this, but I think even just the name Mennonite, and I think you're probably pretty cognizant of this, and I know this is like one of those hot button issues, but even though just the name Mennonite, like, we got to be really attentive to how we work with that and how we wear that name, because I think we have a lot of pride, rightly so, tied up in it and who Mennonites have been. But at the same time, it can become this like very chummy family thing of what school did you go to and what family are you a part of, and who's your uncle and whatever. And I wrote an article for Anabaptist World not long ago, and I was interviewing pastors of churches that changed their names. And one of the fascinating things for me, Mennonite churches that changed their names, some of them had some pretty dramatic stories of how they were able to really connect in a new way in their community. So I don't want to overplay that, but just say, like, I think we got to be attentive to how our churches are sometimes part of the structure, and ask ourselves, what are the barriers that are keeping people from connecting? Because you know what? It is all about relationships. And structure is about relationships, and our churches are trying to extend to us. We're trying to build relationships for the kingdom. The gospel is not just a good word. The gospel is a good relationship with Jesus, but also building people into the family of God, the Father, the one from whom all people on earth get their name, right? It's this relationship. And so the pastor can kind of model going out into the community and finding ways to step over the barbed wire, build relationships, connect with people every time. But it's got to be the whole church. And every time I talk to pastors and I say, like, if I find a church where things are going well, I'm always eager to find out why things are going well in their church. And I'm always like, hey man, what is the secret sauce in your rural church? Like, why is it growing? And everybody laughs at me when I ask that question. And then they always say something along the lines of relationships. Right? Connect with people. The other thing they always say is prayer, and we'll come back to that this afternoon. But relationships, and we relate people into the family of God. And so we've got to just kind of come and be hopeful. We've got to come and be authentic with people, not trying to relate to them solely because we want to get them in the church. People can detect that in a heartbeat. But we want to be the kind of people that can reach out to folks and be incorporating more and more people into our circles of relationships. We want to invite questions. We've got this new family that's been connecting in our church. It's been so beautiful to get to know them over the last year. They've got a couple of kids. And I remember 10 years ago, when we first moved to Moundridge, we were sitting on the sidelines of a soccer game, and I started up a conversation with this family. I'm like, oh, hi, I'm Brad. This is my wife, Lisi. And the lady says to us, I'm not even joking, she says to me, we're perfectly happy with our church, thank you. So we got to be careful, right? Like, I hadn't even got to my pitch yet, but I mean, just trying to get to know people. We don't want to be the ones that all we can do is talk to people because we're inviting them to church. But here they are, they've been part of our church, and really they grew into our church because they grew into relationship with us and us into them. They're our friends. We got to know them. Our kids play together, right? And I started a junior high youth group, and two of their kids come to that, and then they started showing up on Sunday morning. But it's all about those relationships. Rural churches, I think if we can wake up to this and we have the value system to actually take action, we can be a body that can kind of situate ourselves on the edge of that barbed wire and help people who are on the out find a way in. We can be that border crossing, bridge crossing entity. Because I think one of the main questions that rural people often ask is, are you one of us? They want to know that about their pastors. Are you one of us? Do you care about us? Are you one of us? But they want to know that about other people too. Are you one of us before I get to know you? And it's not always a fair question, but we can be a place where people can become part of the us in the best sense. I was talking to somebody a while back, and they were telling me how they were in a conversation. It was an older lady, and she was in a conversation with a longtime Moundridge family, and the person said to her, the lady said to her, "Oh, I've never met you. Are you new here?" And she said, "Well, are you new here?" And she said, "Well, I married into a family from Moundridge. My husband and I have lived here in Moundridge for 30 years. And she said, "Oh, so you are new." Right? I mean, that's what a lot of people face, right? And so can we be the kind of people who help people join into that us? And it can be so hard for pastors to come in from the outside, but I think what we want to do is craft this sense of being for rural people in for real places, just kind of communicate over and over again that you matter to me, you matter to us, and develop this love for people of places. And there's a lot that we can say about this, but I think the very basic thing that we do is we come in and we notice and we value the identity of the place. And we don't want to get reductionistic. It's not just like, just love the people, but it is starting with love of people. And understanding in a biblical sense goes hand in hand with love. And so we speak to hope, we speak optimistically, we try to be authentic to people. We realize that people can get locked into this kind of nostalgia for what was, this nostalgia for something that in their minds was perfect in the past. I remember in the community we served in Washington State, it was like 75% Hispanic, and you'd bump into people that would talk about, "I remember how the town was before," and they would fill in the blank, and you say, and they have this nostalgia for some time in the past where before whatever people group showed up, and they thought that was when it was perfect. And so we're trying to help people to connect into the community as it is and value it and love it as it is. Be Pauline. Right? Think about Paul. He's always such a great model. Paul writes in his letters, just like pretty much everyone except Galatians, he writes in his letters and says things like, "I give thanks every time I think of you," right? Or, "I know about your love and your faith in Jesus and your love for all the saints," right? So, Paul is always looking for ways to do that with people. So anyway, love, that's where it begins. I think that's the foundation for our understanding. Here's what I want to do. We've got about 27 minutes, and I want to invite you to talk a little bit, and I'm going to put a couple of questions up on the screen. Don't worry about getting these down, because we're going to hand out, we have discussion papers. They're on the tables, on the sides, and also over in the tent. And so go to these side tables or go over to the tents, and you've got about 26 minutes to sit down and talk through these questions. And I invite you to use these as kind of reflection on your experience. And if you want, I tried to leave you a little bit of space so that you can kind of journal out your answer. Talk them through and save your paper, because we're going to continue using these for our other two sessions. So I invite you to do that. Go to the side, go to the back tent, and I will kind of hang out in the back and connect with you, and we'll connect up front a little bit later again. Okay, so let's go talk a little bit.